Welcome back. This is Chapter 7 material, and in this video we'll focus on the mechanisms of transport across the membrane. And I'm trying something new so I can draw on my piece of paper. We'll see how it goes. So there is also a worksheet that you can fill out as we go through these questions that will help you compare and contrast the 4 different mechanisms of movement across membranes. So our first question is, what is passive transport? Explain why simple diffusion is an example of passive transport. So here's my drawing of the membrane, and I've got a phospholipid bilayer, a couple of proteins spanning the membrane, and some cholesterol drawn in. This is an animal membrane. This is the outside of maybe the cell and the inside of the cell. And we're thinking about, how do molecules cross this membrane? That's the question, or that's the idea at least, okay? So what is passive transport? Well, first of all, it's passive. What do we know about that word passive? Is energy required? No. No energy is required for passive transport. And so when we're thinking about molecules that use passive transport across the membrane, we say, no energy is required. Simple diffusion is an example of passive transport. Well, what do we mean by simple diffusion? What does that term mean? Diffusion is determined or defined as the movement of molecules down their concentration and their electrical gradient. The movement of molecules down or with their concentration or electrical gradient. Okay, so molecules are moving from high to lower concentration, right? They're moving from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And that's what diffusion is, the movement of molecules, the spreading out of molecules. We're interested in diffusion across membranes, and some molecules can simply diffuse directly across the membrane. I call that simple diffusion. So some molecules can diffuse across the membrane. What kinds? Well, what if we have a high concentration of oxygen outside of this membrane and a low concentration of oxygen inside the membrane? Okay, so I maybe have to shift my drawing a minute so you can see that. There we go. Well, which direction will oxygen move by diffusion? Well, it should move from high to low. And it does. And in fact, it moves, its oxygen is small and it's not charged, and it can directly diffuse across the membrane from areas of high to low concentration. Small, uncharged molecules or nonpolar molecules can directly diffuse across the membrane. So molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide, are small and non-polar, are uncharged. So these would be good examples of molecules that can directly diffuse across the membrane from high to low concentration. There is a diagram in your manual or in your book that shows us how molecules diffuse across membranes, and this membrane here is drawn in your diagram. And molecules in this case diffuse by moving across the membrane to the right in this case, so that eventually the molecules are in equal concentration on both sides of the membrane. The second diagram here shows what happens when there are 2 different types of molecules, each diffusing across the membrane. Okay, so let's answer this question. What types of molecules can pass directly through the membrane by simple diffusion? Oops, we've already answered that. Small, nonpolar, and definitely uncharged molecules. They have to be small because it's difficult to pass through that tight membrane. They have to be nonpolar or uncharged because polar charged molecules would have a hard time passing through the phospholipid bilayer, because that phospholipid bilayer has those hydrophobic tails to worry about, right? So molecules that are like big molecules, like a disaccharide or an amino acid, are too big to pass through the membrane. Some ions are too charged. Potassium and chloride ions, they're not going to pass through the membrane directly. So just our small nonpolar uncharged molecules, great examples are carbon dioxide and oxygen. Okay. Question 2. Explain how water moves across membranes. Be sure to mention osmosis and aquaporins. Okay, now think about water a minute. Water can travel across membranes by diffusion. So if we have a high concentration of water on this side of the membrane and a low concentration of water on this side of the membrane, which way will water move by diffusion? Well, water should move from high to low concentration by diffusion. The molecules just spread out, right? So we expect water to move this direction by simple diffusion. Oh, but can water molecules move directly through the membrane? Can these water molecules directly pass across the membrane by simple diffusion? This is a tricky question. They're polar, and this hydrophobic bilayer might not like them. It's hydrophobic after all, right? Water hating or water fearing. But water molecules are small enough so that they can slowly pass across the membrane by what we call simple diffusion. And to speed up the movement of water across membranes, there are protein helpers or channels called aquaporins. Can you see that in there? I think I wrote it in just in the right place. Aquaporins that allow water molecules to pass through the membrane, to diffuse through the membrane. Aquaporins are a special facilitator molecule or transport protein. They're called a water channel. Aquaporin, water pores is really what they're called. And so water can move across the membrane by diffusion in both of these cases from areas of high to low water concentration, but they use